The horn sounded 3 long blasts across the mountain pass, and every head in the Orc clan gathering turned toward the gate where Joseph Sutton walked in alone. He had not planned to be at the Grimrock Gathering. He had not planned to be anywhere near these mountains at all. 3 weeks ago he had been standing on the docks of Crestfall Bay, hauling in nets heavy with silver mackerel, salt in his beard and cold spray on his face, living the only life he had ever known. Then the monastery town of Veth had seized his fishing vessel as debt collateral for a harbor master he had never met, and suddenly Joseph Sutton had no boat, no income, and no reason to stay on the coast. So he had walked inland with 60 copper coins in his pocket and a weathered oilskin pack on his back, following a rumor that the Grimrock clan was hiring travelers as guides through the high passes, and he had arrived at the worst possible moment, the Midsummer Clan Gathering, when every warrior, elder, and matriarch within 2 days' ride had assembled in the broad canyon that the Grimrock called home. He stepped through the gate made of crossed mammoth tusks, and the crowd of orcs went quiet in the way that a forest goes quiet when a rabbit wanders into a wolf den. Joseph was not a small man by human standards. He stood a little over 5 feet and 9 inches, broad across the chest from years of hauling rope and rowing against tide, with calloused hands and a jaw that had weathered more salt storms than he could count. He had dark hair the color of wet sand, brown eyes that had learned to read weather at 100 yards, and a scar along his left forearm from a net hook that had slipped badly during a winter storm 7 years ago. He was, by most human measures, an ordinary and honest-looking man. But by orc standards, he was a child standing in a forest of trees. The Grimrock warriors ranged from 6 feet to well over 7, their shoulders broad enough to block doorways, their arms corded with muscle developed through decades of mountain life. Even the young ones, barely past their coming-of-age rites, looked at him the way grown men look at a sparrow that has wandered into a stable. The elders, gray-tusked and wrapped in clan furs despite the summer heat, peered at him with something between amusement and outright bafflement. And then the laughter started. It was not cruel laughter, or at least not entirely. Some of it was genuine surprise, the shocked bark of warriors who had simply never seen something quite this unexpected. One particularly large warrior near the fire pit, a massive orc with arms the diameter of Joseph's waist and a laugh like a boulder bouncing down a slope, slapped his knee and said something in Orcish that Joseph did not understand, but the translation was evident in the guffaws that followed. Joseph set his jaw. He had grown up in fishing villages. He had dealt with sea captains who thought coastal fishermen were lesser than harbor merchants, and harbor merchants who thought anyone who worked with their hands was lesser than them. He had a spine made of salt-soaked rope and stubbornness, and he was not going to turn around. He was trying to figure out who he needed to speak to about the guide work, scanning the crowd for someone who looked approachable when the laughter changed. It did not stop, but it shifted, the way a crowd shifts when someone steps out of it with a different kind of energy, and Joseph followed the change to its source. She was standing at the edge of the gathered warriors, near one of the long stone tables where the gathering feast was being laid out. She was not the tallest orc in the canyon, though she was tall, perhaps 6 feet and 2 inches, which put her eye level with the collarbone of the loudest laughing warrior. She was perhaps 25 years of age, which in orc reckoning made her fully a woman and past the first blush of youth, but nowhere near the weathered elder stage. Her skin was the deep green of old pine trees, smooth except for a thin scar that cut diagonally across her left cheekbone, a dueling scar, Joseph would learn later, earned honestly. Her tusks were shorter than many of the warriors, curved and ivory-white, polished clean. Her dark hair was braided back in a thick rope that fell between her shoulder blades, threaded through with a single red bead that clicked when she moved. She wore a fitted warrior's vest of stitched boar leather, close against her torso, laced with rawhide down the front, cut to show the strong lines of her arms. Her riding leathers were deep charcoal, tight through the thigh, tucked into knee-high boots of dark elk hide. At her hip sat a short blade in a worn scabbard, and around her right forearm was a bracer of hammered copper clanmark for the Grimrock. Joseph would come to understand, denoting a full warrior of proven rank. She was extraordinary. Not softly pretty, not decorative, but striking in the way that wild things are striking the way a hawk is striking, or a stretch of ocean that could kill you, and is still the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. She was looking at the laughing warriors with an expression that could have cured meat. Then she looked at Joseph. He met her gaze directly, because he did not know enough about orc custom to know that averting your eyes was considered polite when you were vastly outranked. And so he just looked back at her the way he looked at the horizon when he was trying to read incoming weather, steady, assessing, without flinching. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition, or surprise at a lack of the expected flinching. She pushed away from the stone table and walked toward him, and the laughter around the fire pit redoubled, because several warriors assumed she was going to pick the small human up by his collar and deposit him back outside the gate. She crossed the distance between them in long, even strides, stopped 2 feet in front of him, and looked him over the way a buyer at a market looks over a horse she has not yet decided to purchase. "You are here for the guide work," she said. Her common tongue was accented, not broken. She knew the language well, just shaped it with the harder consonants of Orcish. "That is correct," Joseph said. "Joseph Sutton out of Crestfall Bay. I was told the Grimrock clan was looking for someone who knows the eastern passes." "Most of the eastern passes we know well enough," she said. "The ones above the snowline past the Fellridge Fork, those are different. They shift every spring. The snow comes down in different channels, the safe paths move. I have taken supply runs through those passes for the monastery town of Veth for the last 6 years. I know them better than anyone you have here." It was a direct claim, made to an orc warrior at a clan gathering, and around them the laughter quieted by a degree as several orcs leaned in to hear what she would say. "You are confident," she said. "It was not a compliment, not yet." "I am accurate," Joseph said. "There is a difference." She stared at him for 3 heartbeats. Then she did something that none of the watching warriors had apparently expected, because the laughter died completely and a different quality of silence settled over the canyon. She said, "I am Ugak Grimtusk. I lead the Eastern Scouting Band. Come, we will talk." And she turned and walked toward the far end of the stone tables, expecting without looking back that he would follow. He followed. Behind them, someone started laughing again, low and disbelieving, and Joseph heard what he thought was another orcish comment made at his expense. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Ugak turned her head exactly 45 degrees, not even fully looking back, and leveled a glare over her shoulder at the speaker that could have stripped bark from a tree. The laughter stopped as though cut by a blade. She did not say a word. She simply looked, and the warrior who had spoken found somewhere else to be. Joseph filed that away. He was already learning her. They sat across from each other at the far end of the stone table, away from the feast preparations and the watching crowd, and she asked him sharp, specific questions about the passes, the Fellridge Fork timing, the ice shelf conditions in late summer, the narrow ledge trail above the Veth supply road that most travelers did not know existed. He answered every question without embellishment, drawing roots with his finger on the dust of the tabletop. She listened the way soldiers listen to scouts, completely, without interruption, filing everything. When he was done, she asked 3 follow-up questions, and he answered those too. "The Grimrock do not often hire humans," she said, when they had been talking for an hour. "I know that," Joseph said. "I also know that the Veth monastery town has been blocking your clan's access to the lower trade routes, and without those routes you cannot get your winter salt supply before the first freeze. The passes I know go around Veth's border posts entirely. I can get your supply wagons through clean." The look she gave him then was different from the first appraisal. It was something closer to respect, or the beginning of it, which in Ugak Grimtusk's face looked a great deal like being studied very carefully. "How do you know about the salt supply problem?" she said. I'm a fisherman from Crestfall Bay. I have been listening to trade arguments for my entire adult life. I pay attention." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The pay is 12 silver for the full guide season, 2 weeks through the passes, lodging and meals provided." 15, Joseph said. "And I want it in writing because I have had men promise me things they did not deliver." She looked at him for another long moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, a small and controlled thing that he would come to learn was the orc equivalent of a full grin. 14, she said, "and I will write it myself." "Done," Joseph said and held out his hand. She looked at the offered hand, and then she gripped it careful, he noticed, not to crush it, which she easily could have done, but matching his grip honestly. Her hand was warm and rough-palmed and much larger than his, and the copper bracer on her forearm caught the late sun and threw a sliver of light across his face. "The gathering runs 3 more days," she said. "You will eat with my band. We leave on the 4th morning." He nodded. She released his hand and stood, and for just a moment she looked across the canyon at the warriors who had laughed, who were watching from a careful distance, with expressions ranging from confused to affronted. She held that gaze across the space until each of them looked away or found something to occupy themselves. Then she walked back toward the feast without looking at Joseph again, but he noticed that she had angled her path so that she passed within 6 feet of the largest laughing warrior and let him see her face close up, and the man found his soup very interesting indeed. Joseph sat at the stone table for a moment longer, watching her go, and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, a specific kind of warmth in the chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He picked up his pack and went to find the cook tent. The next 3 days of the gathering were the most vivid experience of Joseph's life, and he had once been caught in a sea squall that lasted 36 hours. Ugak's scouting band was 8 orcs, 6 warriors, a healer named Prusk who was ancient and quiet and smelled of dried herbs, and a young scout named Draco who was barely 18 and had the enthusiastic energy of a dog that has just discovered it can run. They received Joseph with varying levels of warmth. Prusk accepted him without comment. Draco asked 14 questions in the first hour about what the ocean smelled like. The warriors ranged from wary tolerance to something approaching professional respect once it became clear that Joseph did not panic in close quarters, did not complain about hard sleeping conditions, and could read weather by looking at the sky in a way that Ugak found genuinely useful. The other clans at the gathering were less welcoming. The Boulderbrow clan, who had sent 6 of their biggest warriors as a show of strength, had apparently heard about the small human who had been hired by Ugak's band, and thought it was the funniest thing that had happened at a gathering in living memory. Their chief warrior, a towering orc named Vok who wore the bones of something very large sewn into his vest, made it his personal project to walk past Joseph's campfire at least twice a day, and say something in Orcish that made his companions burst out laughing. On the second evening, Joseph was cleaning his boots near the fire when Vok made his 4th pass, paused, and said in heavily accented common, "Little fisherman, you get lost. The children's camp is on the other side." The Grimrock band around the fire had gone tense, not alarmed but watchful. Joseph looked up from his boot. "I appreciate the concern," he said pleasantly. "You have been checking on me so often I was starting to wonder if you needed something." Vok blinked. He had clearly expected either flinching or anger. "I think he wants direction," said Draco in a stage whisper to no one in particular. From across the fire, Ugak said nothing. She was sharpening her short blade with a whetstone, a slow, rhythmic sound, and she did not look up from her work. But the whetstone paused. Vok gathered himself and said, "Grimtusk hires weak little humans now." "What does that say about Grimrock?" He said it loudly, meant for the surrounding camps to hear. Joseph set down his boot. He said carefully and calmly, "I would not know anything about the honor of the Grimrock. I am new here. But I do know that Ugak Grimtusk hired me because I know something she needed to know, and she was smart enough to recognize it. That seems like strength to me, not weakness. What kind of leader refuses good information because of where it comes from?" There was a silence. It was not a comfortable one. Ugak looked up from the whetstone. She looked at Vok with an expression so flat and steady that it seemed to have physical weight. "You are at the Grimrock fire," she said. "You are not invited." Vok held her gaze for about 4 seconds, which was, Joseph sensed, about 3.5 seconds longer than most orcs managed, and then he turned and walked away and did not come back to that side of the canyon for the rest of the gathering. Ugak watched him go. Then she looked at Joseph, a long, assessing look, and went back to sharpening her blade. But after a moment she said, without looking up, "You speak well under pressure." "I grew up negotiating fish prices with harbor bosses," Joseph said. "Same skill, different stakes." The corner of her mouth moved. "Not always different stakes," she said. "I have seen men die over fish prices." He laughed, an honest, surprised laugh, and after a moment she made a sound that he was beginning to recognize as her version of a laugh, low and brief, contained but genuine. Prusk the healer caught Joseph's eye across the fire and nodded once, a small and deliberate nod that meant something, though Joseph was not yet sure what. On the third evening of the gathering there was a storm. It came down from the mountain peaks in the way high-altitude storms always do, fast and cold, and without much warning. Though Joseph had seen it building in the cloud shapes since mid-afternoon and had quietly moved their supply packs under the stone, overhang an hour before the rain hit. When the storm broke, several of the camp sections were scrambling to protect food and gear from the sudden downpour. Ugak came running from the warrior meeting tent, because the central fire pit's smoke tent had come down, and the coals needed to be covered before the fire was lost entirely, and she and Draco were wrestling with a heavy canvas in the driving rain. Joseph was already there. He had pulled the canvas from where it had collapsed, identified the bent support pole as the problem, taken the spare pole lashing from his own pack, and was on his knees in the mud binding the repair when Ugak arrived. She stopped, rain sheeting off her braids, and looked at him kneeling in the mud fixing a pole by firelight in a storm. "Go," he said, not looking up. "Get the other side. Draco, hold that corner." Draco held that corner. Ugak grabbed the other side. Joseph finished the lashing, stood, and they raised the canvas together, and the fire coals were protected before another minute had passed. They stood in the rain under the restored canopy, Draco grinning and shaking water from his ears, and Ugak looked at Joseph with wet braids plastered to her cheekbones, and something in her face that he did not yet have a name for. "You saw the storm coming," she said. "This morning," he said. The upper clouds were layering wrong. She studied him for a long moment, rain pattering on the canvas above them. "The fisherman reads weather," she said, almost to herself. It sounded like she was slotting him into a category she was still building. "It is the only skill that keeps you alive on the water," he said. She turned away to check the other supply covers, but her hand passed across his shoulder as she went, not a grab, not a shove, just a brief, definite touch. 2 fingers of her big, warm hand on the wet wool of his shirt, a contact that lasted maybe 2 seconds. He felt it for much longer than 2 seconds. The fourth morning came gray and cold, the storm having washed the canyon clean, and the gathering began to break apart as clans prepared to ride in their separate directions. The Boulderbrow warriors loaded their horses loudly and made a show of their numbers. Other clans said formal goodbyes with the ritual touching of foreheads that Prusk had quietly explained was the Grimrock version of a handshake between equals. Ugak's band moved with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no ceremony beyond what was required, everyone knowing their role. Joseph fell into the rhythm of it without being told where to put himself, because he had been a fisherman long enough to know that the best crew member is the one who reads what is needed and does it before being asked. He loaded the supply mule's near-side bags, checked the lashing on Draco's pack saddle where the buckle was wearing, and was standing with his own pack ready when Ugak walked over. She handed him a folded paper. The 14 silver agreement, written in her own hand, in both Orcish script and common, with her clan mark pressed into the bottom in dark wax. He tucked it inside his oilskin pack. "Thank you," he said. "Do not lose the way," she said, which was Ugak's version of a beginning. They left the canyon as the sun cracked the peaks, 8 orcs and 1 human, heading into the high passes where Joseph Sutton had spent most of his adult life doing hard and quiet work, and he felt, for the first time in several bleak and difficult months, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The passes were brutal and beautiful in the way that only mountain country can manage simultaneously. The Fellridge Fork was 2 days hard climbing from the canyon, through pine forest that gave way to bare gray rock, and then to snow fields that were deceptive in the way that summer snow always is, soft on top, iron-hard below, with hidden melt channels running underneath that could swallow a loaded mule to the belly. Joseph led them around the worst of it by routes he had mapped over 6 years of supply running for Veth, routes that existed in his memory as a kind of bodily knowledge rather than conscious thought. The angle of a boulder formation that meant safe ice below, the color of the rock face that signaled unstable ground, the particular quality of wind through a narrow pass that told you whether the way was clear or not. Ugak watched him work with an attention that he felt on the back of his neck. She did not hover or micromanage. She did not second-guess his route calls or demand explanations. She simply observed, and when he glanced back he would sometimes catch her looking at him with that steady, measuring expression, and she would not look away as some people do when caught staring. She just held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the terrain. On the 3rd night, camped in the shelter of a granite overhang with a small fire that Prusk kept low and smokeless, the band settled into the comfortable quiet of people who had traveled together long enough to not need constant conversation. Draco had fallen asleep almost immediately, as young men with boundless energy often do, flat out and deeply gone. The 3 warriors on watch were posted at the perimeter. Prusk was sorting herbs with the focused calm of someone who has done this 10,000 times. Joseph was mending a split in the strap of his pack by firelight, needle, and waxed thread from the small repair kit he had carried for years. It was fiddly work in the low light, and he was concentrating on it when he became aware that Ugak had settled near him, not across the fire, not at the warrior distance, but near, close enough that if he stretched his arm he would have brushed her bracer. "You carry a sewing kit," she said. "Every fisherman does. You cannot wait for a seamstress when you are at sea with a torn sail." She considered this. "Warriors should carry them too," she said. "Too much pride." "A lot of men die of too much pride," Joseph said. She made the low, brief sound that was her laugh. She had her own piece of gear in her hands, a strap from her pack that had a similar problem to his, and without making any particular announcement about it, she simply sat there and began to repair it as he repaired his, and they worked in a shared quiet that was the most comfortable Joseph had felt in he did not know how long. She worked methodically, with the same precise economy that she brought to everything. He watched her hands from the corner of his eye, those large, capable, green-brown hands with their rough palms and the neat edge of the copper bracer. She had not had a sewing kit, he realized. She had found a length of sinew from Prusk's kit and a bone needle, improvised, and she was making it work. "You could borrow my thread," he said. She looked at his thread and then at her sinew. Then she put the sinew down and accepted his thread without comment. He passed her the needle too, because his was finer and the sinew-toughened holes in her strap needed a finer approach. "I do not usually sit near the fire on watch nights," she said after a while. "I noticed," he said. "You notice a great deal," she said. "It is also the skill that keeps you alive on the water," he said. She made the sound again. Then she said, not looking up from her stitching, "Why did you come to the gathering alone? Most humans who seek Grimrock work send a letter first or come with a trader who knows us." "I did not have time for letters," he said. "My boat was taken. I had 60 copper coins and a rumor about guide work. I came." She looked up at that. "They took your boat." The harbor master at Crestfall Bay died in debt to a Veth monastery creditor. The creditor seized the harbor assets. My boat was moored at that harbor. The law, apparently, is that moored property can be attached. I tried to argue it. He paused. I am a better sailor than a lawyer. Something moved in her expression. Not pity, he would have hated pity, but recognition. Veth, she said, the monastery town on the mountain road. The same one that has been blocking your salt routes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Veth has been a problem for the Grimrock for 3 years, she said, since the new administrator took over. Who is the administrator? Joseph said. A man named Casternell, she said, and the way she said the name carried the quality of a stone dropping into still water. He is not the rightful one. The old administrator, Marin Toll, died 2 years ago. Toll's niece should have inherited the seat. It is the Veth custom. The administrator's seat passes to the nearest blood. Toll had no children. His niece Fen Toll lives in the town, she is known there. But Casternell arrived with documents saying Marin Toll had changed the inheritance before death. No one has seen these documents. He controls the town guard, he controls the road gates, and he has been restricting trade through the passes in ways that hurt the clans more than they hurt the settled villages. Joseph set down his mending. You think the documents are false? I know they are false, she said. Marin Toll was Prusk's cousin. They wrote to each other for 40 years. In his last letter, 3 months before his death, he said nothing about changing the inheritance. He said nothing about Casternell at all. The fire popped and settled. On the other side of the camp, Prusk did not look up from his herbs, but Joseph had the impression the old healer was listening. What does your clan want to do about it? Joseph asked. We are not in a position to march on a walled town, Ugak said, with a flatness that was more frustration than defeat. We would be painted as raiders, which would bring the valley settlements against us. We need the documents, or someone who can reach Fen Toll, or something that proves Nell's claim is a lie. We have been trying to find a way in for 2 years. She stopped, seeming to realize she had said more than she intended, and straightened. It is clan business, not yours. My boat is in a harbor owned by a creditor from Veth, Joseph said. Nell's trade restrictions drove down harbor traffic, which hurt the harbor master's income, which created the debt. It is a chain. Pull it far enough back, and Casternell is why I am sitting on this mountain right now. She looked at him for a long moment. Your boat matters to you. It is everything I have, he said, simply and honestly, and the simplicity of it seemed to land on her differently than a performance of feeling would have. You know Veth, she said slowly. You have made supply runs there. 6 years of them. I know the town layout. I know the guard rotations on the east gate. They have not changed in 4 years because the gate captain is a creature of habit. I know which dockmaster lets you through to the monastery stores for a small consideration. You would go into that town, she said. For my boat back, I would go through a great deal worse than a walled town. He looked at her steadily. And for the right cause, I might go through worse than that without any boat involved. Ugak Grimtusk looked at him across the firelight for a long, serious moment. Then she folded his mended strap and handed back his needle and thread and said, We will finish the guide run. Then we will talk about Veth. He took back his needle and thread. Their fingers touched in the exchange, and neither of them moved away from the contact immediately. It was small. It was nothing by any external measure, but it was also, he thought, everything. They finished the pass run in 12 days, 3 ahead of the schedule Ugak had expected, because Joseph cut a route through the fellridge that avoided a secondary ice field that the Grimrock band had been navigating around for years, saving 2 full days. The supply wagons came through clean, and the Grimrock salt supply for the winter was secured. When they returned to the canyon, Ugak paid him 14 silver as contracted, and he had the piece of paper to prove it. He counted the coins not because he doubted her, but because the counting was part of the respect. He should have left. He had money now and options. He could have gone north to find other work, or west to one of the harbor towns that might need an experienced seaman. He stayed. He told himself it was because of Veth, because of his boat, because the clan business Ugak had described was a thread he was not willing to leave unpulled. These were true reasons. They were not the only ones. Ugak did not ask him to stay. She also did not tell him to go. She simply included him in the evening plans when he was there, and when he said he would like to help with the Veth problem, she looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Come and eat. We will talk." In the weeks that followed, he found himself living at the edges of the Grimrock Canyon settlement. He slept in the traveler's shelter near the east wall, a stone and thatch structure that the clan kept for traders and guests. He helped with what he could. There was always work to be done in any settlement, and Joseph Sutton had never in his life been comfortable sitting still. He helped mend fishing nets that the clan used in the mountain streams, which made Draco ask 17 questions about ocean fishing. He helped relash a supply frame that the pack mules had damaged against a narrow gate. Small work but visible work, the kind that said he was not a burden, and he spent hours with Ugak planning. She had maps, rough ones, drawn in charcoal on scraped hide of the Veth monastery town's outer walls and the main road approach. He improved them from memory, adding the east gate position, the secondary postern in the monastery's north wall that was only guarded during daylight, the internal courtyard layout that he had traversed a dozen times on supply runs. Prusk contributed what he knew from his correspondence with Marin Toll, the location of the administrator's records room, which was in the monastery proper on the upper floor, accessible via the main cloister stairs. "The records room," Joseph said, studying the map. "If Nell has documents, false or otherwise, that is where they will be kept. If we can get to them and show the town council that the inheritance documents are forged, the council is required by Veth charter to convene a hearing," Ugak said. "It would not be immediate, but it would be a process. It would give Fen Toll grounds to contest." "Does Fen Toll know about any of this?" Joseph asked. "We have tried to get word to her." "The town is difficult. Nell controls the gate records. Everyone who enters or leaves is noted." "I can enter without being noted," Joseph said. "I know the postern." Ugak looked at him carefully. "And if Nell recognizes that his records room has been entered, then he knows someone was looking. He does not know what was found or who unless we give him a reason to look." Joseph paused. "Or unless I am caught." "If you are caught in Veth," Ugak said, with a quiet that was actually a warning, "Nell will put you in the monastery cells. He has used them before. A trader was held for 3 weeks for toll evasion. There are no windows in those cells." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "Then we make sure I am not caught," he said. "Or we make sure there is a plan for if I am." The plan took 2 weeks to develop, and Ugak and Joseph spent most of those 2 weeks together bent over maps, arguing about timing, arguing about contingencies, arguing with some heat, and then coming to the same conclusions through the friction of two people who are both used to being right. They argued about everything and agreed about most of it eventually, and the arguing itself became a thing Joseph looked forward to because it meant being close to her, watching her think, watching the way she moved her hands when she was explaining something she felt strongly about. She was extraordinary. The more time he spent with her, the more layered she became, fierce and direct in public. But in private conversation, there was a dry humor that emerged slowly, a sharpness of observation, a capacity for sudden and unexpected gentleness. She brought him food from the clan kitchen without ceremony on the evenings they worked late, setting it beside him without comment, as though it were simply a logistical decision and not a thing she had chosen to do. She corrected his pronunciation of Orcish words with exact, patient repetition until he got them right, and did not mock him for the attempts. She told him once about the dueling scar on her cheek, a young warrior who had thought challenging a female officer would be easy, and described the duel itself without drama, just facts, the way she described everything. He had the impression she had not told many people the story. On an evening in late summer, when the planning was largely done and they were sitting outside the records tent watching the last light leave the peaks, she said abruptly, "You could leave before the Veth run. Take your pay and go. There is no contract for this. "I know that," he said. "It is not your fight." "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep disagreeing." She looked at him sideways. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing honesty over cleverness. "Because I am tired of not being somewhere," he said. "For 6 years I was on a boat and the boat was home. I was not exactly lonely on the boat, but I was alone on it most of the time, and I thought that was fine. Then the boat was gone and I realized that the thing I had been missing was not equipment. It was people, a place, something to be part of." He looked at her. "This is somewhere. All of this is somewhere. I would like to stay somewhere for a while." She was very still for a moment. The red bead in her braid clicked softly as the wind moved. "You are a strange man," she said, but the tone of it was not an insult. It was more the way you would describe a coastline you had never seen before, unfamiliar but worth looking at. "Probably," he said. She reached over, not looking at him, and took his hand. Not the way she had gripped it at the gathering, formal and mutual, but differently, her fingers wrapping around his from above, his hand engulfed in her warm palm, held there with a quiet certainty. She kept looking at the darkening peaks. He kept looking at the side of her face. "If you are caught in those cells," she said, "I will come for you." "I know," he said, and meant it absolutely. She held his hand until the last light was gone, and then she released it and stood and said, "Sleep. We leave in 3 days," and walked back toward the canyon interior without looking back. He sat outside for another hour, watching the stars come out over the peaks, and thought that he had not felt this specific warmth in his chest in so long that he had almost forgotten what it was called. He remembered now. They went into Veth in early autumn, when the monastery town was busy with the harvest trade, and a steady flow of farmers and traders through the gates made individuals less notable. Ugak left most of the band at a camp in the foothills. 8 orcs attempting to enter a walled human town would not have been subtle. She came with only Draco, who wore a trader's cloak and kept his hood up, and with Joseph, who wore his usual oilskin coat and walked into the east gate like a man who had done this 100 times because he had. The east gate guards recognized him. This was the risk they had assessed and decided was actually an advantage. He was a known face, a regular supply runner, not a suspicious newcomer. They waved him through with the bored efficiency of guards, who have seen the same face too many times to care about it. Ugak and Draco came in through the north postern 40 minutes later, through a section of the wall that was, as Joseph had noted on the map, absolutely unguarded between the 3rd and 5th bells of morning, a gap in the rotation that spoke to either confidence or laziness in Castor Nell's guard management. They met in the shadow of the cloister's outer wall, where the monastery's north garden lay dormant and brown with autumn, and Ugak materialized from a shadow so completely that Joseph took an involuntary half-step backward before he caught himself. "You are early," he said. "The postern was unwatched earlier than you estimated," she said. She looked around the garden with the quick, thorough scan of a scout. "The records room is above the main cloister. Show me." He showed her. The monastery of Veth was an old building, stone upon stone built over generations, with the particular architectural logic of a place that had been added to by people who did not always talk to each other. The main cloister was accessible through a passage off the north garden, up a set of exterior stairs, and along a covered walkway. The records room was at the end of this walkway, identified by a door with a heavy iron lock that had been installed more recently than the rest of the door frame, which told you something about when Nell had decided the records needed securing. Joseph had a lockpick. He had purchased it in the first harbor town he had visited as a young man, from an old sailor who said every honest man should know how a lock worked from both sides. He had never used it criminally in his life, but he had used it twice to open supply lockers whose keys had gone overboard, and he was competent enough. The lock took him 4 minutes, which felt like 40, while Ugak stood behind him on the walkway watching the courtyard below with the stillness of a hawk on a branch. The door opened. They went in. Castor Nell's records room smelled of tallow candles and anxious organization. the particular smell of a man who has something to hide and has compensated by filing everything in triplicate. The shelves were densely packed, labeled in a careful, small hand. Ugak took the left wall, Joseph took the right, and they worked by the thin moonlight through the narrow window, not risking a candle. Prusk had described the inheritance document as something that would have been executed in the last 3 months of Marin Toll's life. Toll had died in the month of frost, so they were looking for something dated in the month of iron or later. Joseph worked methodically through the date-labeled files, reading quickly, sliding papers back neatly. Ugak was doing the same, her large hands careful and precise. "Here," she said, in a breath barely above silence. He crossed to her. She held a document flat against the faint moonlight. Even in the poor light he could see what she had seen. The date was month of harvest, which was correct for the period. But the signature was wrong. Prusk had seen Marin Toll's signature many times. He had described it in detail, a distinctive leftward slant on the M and a long trailing line below the L in Toll. This signature had neither feature. "That is not his hand," Joseph said. "No," she said. She was holding the paper with a focused intensity that was very close to anger. "No, it is not. We cannot take it. If it goes missing, Nell knows someone was here. We do not need to take it," she said. She reached into her vest and produced a small folded square of paper and a charcoal stick, and made a quick, accurate copy of the key details, the date, the witness names, the signature. It took her under 3 minutes. She replaced the document exactly, and they left the room the same way they had entered. Joseph relocked the door behind them. They found Fen Toll in the town's lower quarter, in the house that Prusk had written down from memory, a narrow building between a cobbler's shop and a dyer's yard that had belonged to the Toll family for 3 generations. Draco was waiting in the street as watch when they knocked. Fen Toll was 30 years old, with her uncle's precise eyes and the expression of someone who has been waiting for bad news long enough to have developed an immunity to it. She listened to Ugak's summary and studied the copied document details with the same careful attention, and when she was done she said, "I know 2 former cloister monks who were present in the month of harvest when my uncle was ill. They would testify that he was not in a state to execute documents." She looked at the copy. "And the witness names on this. One of them is a man named Porrell, who has worked for Nell since before my uncle died. He is not an independent witness." "Can you take this to the town council?" Joseph said. "I have tried before. Nell controls access to the council. He does not allow petitions unless they are filed through the administrator's office. Through him." Her mouth compressed. "But if I had the actual document, not a copy, to show at a public assembly, the council is required to convene if 100 citizens demand it. I know enough people in this town who are tired of Nell to get 100 names." Ugak said, "The document is in the records room. If we could get it out, the document goes missing, Nell closes the town," Joseph said. "He locks the gates, uses it as a pretext." The 3 of them were quiet. Outside, they heard Draco's coded double tap on the door frame, someone in the street, "Keep still," and they waited in silence until the footsteps outside passed. "There is another way," Fen Toll said slowly. "If there were witnesses who saw the document in situ here, in the records room, and could testify to its contents and the false signature, the council could compel Nell to produce it. He cannot make it disappear then. If it disappears under a compulsion order, that itself is evidence." "You need witnesses who have been in the records room," Joseph said. "Yes." Ugak and Joseph looked at each other. In the dark of Fen Toll's narrow front room, with autumn wind coming under the door and the sound of the cobbler's yard settling for the night, they had a full conversation without speaking a word of it. Then Ugak said, "We were there tonight. We both saw it." "An orc's testimony in a Veth council proceeding," Joseph said carefully. "I know," she said. The flatness in her voice was the kind that comes from long practice with the same obstacle. "Mine would be accepted," he said, "and Draco's could be presented as a trade witness if he keeps his hood up during the document viewing and is presented as a trader's assistant." "You would testify," Fen Toll said, looking at Joseph. I would. But the petition has to be filed before Nell has any reason to suspect someone has been in his records room. It has to happen fast. Tomorrow, Fen Toll said. She straightened with the resolve of someone who has been waiting 2 years for this exact conversation. I will have the names by midday. Can you be at the public square at second bell of afternoon? Yes, said Ugak and Joseph at the same time. What happened the next day was not the plan. Joseph was at the public square at first bell of afternoon, ahead of schedule, because he had learned that arriving early gave you the lay of the ground. He was watching the crowd gather. Fen Toll was moving through it, speaking quietly to people he did not know, building the petition count, when he felt a hand close on his collar. He was grabbed by 2 of Nell's town guards, big men in the green and gray livery that marked Veth's administrative authority, and marched through the square with enough force and speed that the crowd parted around them. Several people stared. Several more looked away with the practiced incuriosity of people who have learned not to see what the administrator's guards are doing. He did not struggle. Struggling in the middle of a public square with 2 guards would have turned a detainment into a scene, and a scene would scatter the petition crowd before Fen Toll had her 100 names. So he went with them, walking under his own power, and they took him through the monastery's west entrance and down a stone staircase that smelled of cold water and old stone, and put him in a cell. It was small and dark, as Ugak had warned. There was no window. There was a straw pallet, a water bucket, and an iron door with a small barred slot for the passing of food. The lock was a different kind than the records room lock. A heavy bar slid from outside, not a tumble mechanism, which meant his lockpick was useless. He sat on the pallet and thought about what had happened. Someone had told Nell that he had been asking questions. Not about the records room. They had been careful. No one had seen them in the cloister. But his presence in the town was suspicious enough. A known supply runner who had no supply run scheduled, arriving the day before an unusual crowd was gathering in the square. He thought about Ugak. She had said, "If you are caught, I will come for you." He believed her. He just did not want her coming for him in a way that destroyed the plan. The cell door opened 3 hours later. Not all the way. The bar slid back and the door opened 6 inches, and a man he did not know looked in. Middle-aged, well-dressed in the town administrator's style, with the particular expression of someone who is very comfortable giving other people a hard time. Castor Nell. Joseph Sutton, the man said. Crestfall fisherman, no current vessel, no supply contract currently active with Veth Monastery. What exactly brought you to our town today? I was looking for work, Joseph said. He said it flat and bored, the way innocent men answer questions they find insulting. My vessel was taken. I am looking for contract runs. Veth is a trading hub. You were seen speaking to Fen Toll last night, Nell said. Joseph let a half-second pass, not long enough to look like shock, just natural processing. I spoke to a woman near the lower quarter. I did not know her name. And your interest in my records room. The half-second he allowed himself then was longer, and he used it to realize 2 things. 1, they had been seen, and 2, Nell was not certain, or he would not be asking. I do not know anything about a records room, Joseph said. Nell studied him for a moment. You will stay here while I look into this, he said. Town law permits administrative detainment of persons without vessel or contract for up to 5 days. The door shut. The bar slid home. Joseph lay back on the pallet and stared at the ceiling and thought. 3 hours is a long time for Ugak. He was right. It was not 3 hours more, it was barely 1, when the sounds above changed. The monastery sat on the mountain face, and sound traveled through its old stone in ways that were unpredictable, voices sometimes loud when they should have been muffled, footsteps sometimes silent when they should have rung. What came to Joseph through the stone was not clarity, but pattern. The pattern of a crowd, a large one, gathered outside. Then voices raised, not in panic, but in the specific register of a public assembly that has reached the point of demanding rather than requesting. And then, very specifically, Through the slot in the door he could hear the staircase, and the staircase carried the sound of very heavy, very even footsteps that he knew with an immediacy that needed no thought at all. The bar on the door slid back. Ugak Grimtusk stood in the doorway, and behind her was a Veth town guard who looked like he would genuinely have preferred to be somewhere else. The guard had his hands visible, and his expression was that of a man who has just had an extremely educational conversation about what happens when he stands in the way of something that has already decided to move. Behind the guard was Fen Toll, holding a piece of paper, and behind Fen Toll was Draco, hood finally down, looking immensely pleased with himself. The council convened, Ugak said, looking at Joseph. The petition had 112 names. The council has issued a compulsion order for the administrator's records. She paused. Nell has already been removed from the monastery by order of the council pending the hearing. The guard released you under council authority. Joseph stood up from the pallet. He said, "How long has the council been convened?" 2 hours, she said. "You were detained 40 minutes into the assembly. We finished before we came for you." He looked at her. He was dirty and tired and had spent 3 hours in a dark cell, and she was standing in the doorway with her braids slightly disordered from, he suspected, the conversation that had persuaded the guard, and she was looking at him with an intensity that was only just barely contained. "You were already going to come for me," he said. "You were only detained for 3 hours," she said. "I decided the council was more efficient than breaking you out directly." "Very practical," he said. "I had Draco watching the cell," she said. "If Nell had moved you before the council finished, the plan would have changed." He stepped out of the cell and into the corridor, and he was a head shorter than her in the confined stone passage, and she was close enough that he could have counted the stitches on her leather vest, and neither of them moved apart. "The plan worked," he said. "Most of it," she agreed. "Which part did not?" "The part where you were in a cell," she said, and her voice had dropped, the public carrying quality gone, something underneath it that was rower. "I do not like that part." "Neither did I," he said honestly. She took a breath. Her hand came up and caught his jaw, not rough but definite, her thumb on his cheekbone, her fingers against the back of his neck, tilting his face up the small necessary degree because of the difference in their heights. It was not a gentle movement. It was certain, claiming direct. "Ugak," he said. "Be quiet," she said, and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. There was nothing uncertain in it. She kissed him the way she did everything, with her full attention, with complete commitment, with the warm, certain heat of someone who has made up her mind and does not second-guess herself. He kissed her back with everything he had, his hands going up to her arms, feeling the leather vest and the copper bracer and the warmth underneath. She made a sound against his mouth that was low and genuine, the sound of someone receiving what they have been wanting for a while, and his heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his ears. Behind them, Draco made a small sound that might have been cleared throat or might have been strangled delight, and Fen Toll said, in a perfectly even voice, "I will give you a moment." Ugak pulled back eventually and looked at him. In the dim of the stone corridor, her eyes were very dark and very steady. He was breathing harder than the situation strictly accounted for. "Good," she said, as though she had confirmed something she had suspected. "Good," he agreed. Draco made the sound again. This time it was definitely delight. The council hearing lasted 2 days. Joseph testified on the first day what he had seen in the records room, the document's date, the false signature, the witness names. He testified clearly and without embellishment, which was apparently a quality the Veth Council was not accustomed to in witnesses. Fen Toll presented the copied details and the former monk's accounts. The council compelled Nell's records room to be opened under supervision, and the document was produced. The signature, viewed in daylight by 3 council members who had known Marin Toll personally, was unanimously declared irregular. Castor Nell, on the second day, was escorted out of Veth Monastery Town under council guard. He had been in control of the town for 2 years through a forged document and a willingness to use the administrative apparatus as a weapon. He left looking like a man who had always known the ground under him was borrowed. Fen Toll was recognized as the legitimate heir to the administrator's seat. Her first act was to issue a written order lifting the trade restrictions on the Grimrock clan's salt routes. Her second act was to order a review of the harbor asset seizures that had been executed under Veth creditor authority during Nell's administration, which included the seizure of moored vessels at Crestfall Bay. Joseph was sitting in the monastery's outer courtyard when Fen Toll came out with the harbor review document and handed it to him. The document listed his vessel, the Marin, a 20-foot open clinker with a good keel and patched sails, as incorrectly seized, and issued an order of return. He read it twice. His hands were not quite steady. "Your boat is yours," Fen Toll said simply. "Go and get it." He looked up at her. He said, "Thank you," she said. "Thank Ugak Grimtusk. She is the one who built the case." She paused, and came to my door in the middle of the night, which I suspect was also her idea. He looked across the courtyard to where Ugak was standing with Draco and Prusk, who had made the journey down from the canyon camp to see the hearing's conclusion. She was not looking at Joseph. She was talking to Prusk, but as though she felt his gaze, she glanced across, and the look she gave him was warm and direct and contained a heat that he felt from 30 feet away. He folded the document and put it in his oilskin pack, next to the 14 silver contract that had started all of this. The journey back to the canyon was 4 days, because they moved without urgency for the first time since Joseph had known Ugak, and the pace felt like a gift. The autumn light was long and gold on the mountain slopes. The larches had gone yellow, and the high peaks had the first white of early-season snow. They walked together at the head of the group, which had expanded slightly. Fen Toll had provided them a supply mule as a gesture of new trade partnership, and Draco was deeply and contentedly in charge of its management. Prusk walked with his patient healer's efficiency. The band of warriors who had come down for the hearing were at the rear. On the second night, camped in the pine forest at the midway elevation with a proper fire and good weather, Ugak and Joseph sat outside the main camp circle, close enough to hear the others but private enough for their own conversation. She had her shoulder against his, which required a slight cant of her posture to accommodate the height difference, and he had leaned into it, and neither had commented on the arrangement. "You are going to Crestfall Bay," she said. It was not quite a question. "I have a document saying my boat is there," he said. "I should probably go and confirm it. And then I have a boat again." He was quiet for a moment. "I have spent 6 years doing solo runs, supply work mostly. It is good work." He paused again. "It is also lonely work." She did not say anything immediately. The fire in the main camp popped, and Draco's laugh rose briefly and fell. "The Grimrock salt routes use the coast road," she said. "The eastern passes lead down to Crestfall Bay's harbor eventually. The supply runs we hired you for are seasonal work, but salt runs happen 3 times a year." 3 times a year, he said. "It is regular work," she said, "with a written contract if you insist." "I always insist," he said. She made the sound that was her laugh. Then she said, "I'm not good at saying things I mean when they are about myself." "I know," he said. "You show them instead." She turned her head and looked at him, and in the fire's edge of light her face was open in a way he had come to understand she let very few people see. "Stay," she said. "Not the supply run, not the contract work." The word by itself meaning what it meant. He looked back at her steadily. "You are sure?" He said, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to hear her say it fully. "I have been sure since the gathering," she said. "I do not choose slowly. When I see a thing clearly, I see it. You saw me at the gathering and thought, this man." He could not entirely keep the surprise and the warmth from his voice. "I saw a man who did not look down when he should have, who did not run when everyone around him was suggesting by their laughter that he should," she said. "That is not a common thing." She paused. "Also, you were very clearly looking at me in a way that you did not notice was obvious." He felt warmth rise in his face. "I thought I was being subtle." "You were not." "Was I at least?" He stopped. "You were very much not," she said, and the warmth in her voice then was something she let be fully warm, no curtailment. He turned toward her and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her this time it was slower, the urgency of the cell corridor replaced by something that had room to breathe, room to be thorough, room to be held between them like a thing that was not going anywhere. Her hand came up and cradled the back of his head, gentle with the same precision she brought to everything, and he had his hands on her arms and felt the warmth of her through the leather, and the cool autumn air around them was entirely irrelevant. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a moment, breathing. "Stay," she said again quietly. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes." She exhaled, and it was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but contained both, the sound of someone releasing something they had been carrying. He felt her shoulders drop a degree, a tension he had not fully seen until it was gone, and realized that the great and steady Ugak Grimtusk had been waiting for this answer with something very close to uncertainty. He held her tighter and felt her arms come around him with the same certainty she put into everything, and the gold-lit mountain forest with its autumn smell of pine and cold, and coming winter settled around them like it was ordinary, like people finding each other was ordinary, which he supposed it was, and also supposed it never entirely was. He went to Crestfall Bay in early winter, when the first mountain snows had made the high passes impassable and trade had quieted for the season. Ugak sent Draco with him, ostensibly for company and for the experience of seeing the coast. Actually, Joseph was certain, because Draco was a reliable set of eyes that reported back to her, a function the young scout performed with cheerful transparency, and absolutely no awareness that he was being used as a messenger pigeon. The Marin was in the harbor, as promised. She was in worse shape than he had left her 6 months sitting under winter covers with no maintenance, but her keel was sound and her hull was intact, and Joseph spent 3 weeks in Crestfall Bay making her right again. Draco helped in ways that were more enthusiastic than useful, but that Joseph genuinely appreciated for the company, asking constantly about sailing and the ocean, which never seemed to bore him. Joseph wrote to Ugak. This was slightly complicated by the fact that he was not certain of her literacy in common beyond functional professional reading, but he wrote in simple, direct language that he thought she would find undemeaning and accurate. He told her about the boat, about the harbor, about the winter light on the water. He told her that the harbor smelled of fish and salt and old wood, and that he had started to notice the ways it was less interesting than a canyon full of orcs. He asked about the salt route plans for spring. Her reply came back with a Grimrock trader 3 weeks later, written in the same direct style he had used, with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything, and it said that the salt route was confirmed for early spring, that Prusk had organized a new herb garden in the canyon and Draco was apparently unbearable about it, and that the canyon was colder than usual this winter. At the bottom, after the logistics and the practical update, she had written, "The fire is where you sat. It is not the same without that argument going on." He read that line 3 times. He told Draco they would head back to the canyon as soon as the Marin was seaworthy. Draco said, with the absolute sincerity of a young man who has fully processed the situation, "I thought you would say that." The spring came early to the mountain country that year, and with it, the first salt run down from the canyon to the coast road, which required someone who knew both ends of the journey, the mountain passes and the harbor dockwork, and the contractual language of a trade arrangement between a clan and a coastal merchant network. Joseph knew both ends. He ran the first salt caravan himself, with Ugak leading the Grimrock escort and the supply wagons moving through the Fellridge routes he had cleared the previous summer. The route was clean and fast, and the Crestfall Bay harbor merchants received the salt at the agreed price, and the salt run became, that spring, the first successful direct trade between the Grimrock clan and the coastal market in 6 years of Nell's interference. On the way back from Crestfall Bay, in the lower foothills where the road widened and the pace slackened, Joseph rode beside Ugak on the borrowed horse the Grimrock had provided him and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized after a moment as the feeling of a decision confirmed. "I want to keep the Marin," he said. "She is a good boat." "Then keep her," Ugak said. "I also want to stay at the canyon," he said. She looked at him sideways. "The boat is in the harbor." "The harbor is half a day's ride from the canyon on a fast horse," he said. "The salt runs go through both. I can manage both." He paused. "If there is a reason to be at the canyon." "You know there is," she said, with the directness that was simply how she spoke. "I wanted to say it out loud," he said, "so we both know." She nodded once. Then she said in a tone that was deliberately matter-of-fact, covering what was underneath it, "There is a structure in the canyon that was used by the old trade liaison. Stone building, separate from the traveler's shelter. Better walls. It has a hearth." He understood what she was saying without the words around it. "I can make do with a hearth," he said. "You would be welcome," she said, and looked away at the road ahead, but not before he caught the edge of her expression, the warmth that she contained so carefully and that he had learned to read exactly. He had never owned property. He had a boat and a pack and 60 copper coins, and then 14 silver, and then a written contract, and the sum total of his portable life had always fit on a 20-foot clinker. Having a room with a hearth in a stone building in a mountain canyon was the most settled he had ever been. He found, to his genuine surprise, that settled suited him. The canyon life was its own kind of work. There were always things to be done. No settlement runs itself. And Joseph had a particular set of skills that intersected usefully with what the Grimrock needed. He ran the trade correspondence that required fluent common and knowledge of coastal merchant practice. He managed the mule maintenance, because it turned out his years of working boat rigging translated directly to pack saddle mechanics, which Prusk found philosophically interesting and Draco found extremely funny. He helped with the supply route logistics through 3 seasons. He learned Orcish, slowly and imperfectly, coached with relentless patience by Ugak, who corrected him every time he mispronounced something, and did so without inflection, just repetition, until he got it right. His Orcish was never beautiful, but it was functional, and the day he managed to conduct a full supply negotiation in it with one of the older clan traders, the old trader looked at him with a surprised and grudging respect that Joseph privately treasured. He ate with the clan, worked with the band, and spent his evenings with Ugak. Their evenings were sometimes planning trade routes, supply timing, the ongoing development of the Veth partnership, which under Fen Toll's administration was becoming genuinely productive. Sometimes they were quieter than that. Sometimes they argued about something, because they were two people with strong opinions and different angles on most questions, and the arguments were among his favorite experiences because she never retreated from a position without a reason, and when she was wrong she said so without ceremony, and when he was wrong she told him directly, and he had never felt more respected in his life. She was not easy. She was demanding, in the way that being known fully by someone is demanding. You cannot be partial or careful, you have to be actually present. She expected honesty because she offered it. She expected consistency because she provided it. She kept her word in every small thing, which meant that when she reached for him in the dark of the stone building with the hearth, or tucked herself against the side of his smaller frame, in a way that required her to angle herself carefully, and that she managed with a grace that moved him, he knew with complete certainty that it was real. There was a night in high summer, months into the arrangement, when a late storm came down from the peaks, and they were inside while the rain hit the stone walls and the hearth was warm and the world outside was chaos, and she was lying against him. She had a particular way of curving herself so that his arm went around her and her head was on his chest, and the geometry of it worked in a way that made him feel paradoxically enormous. Like her choosing to be held by him made him larger, and she said, in a different voice than any she used in public, "I used to think choosing someone smaller was a disadvantage. In the clan structure, choosing someone powerful is smart strategy. and he said, and I think I was thinking about the wrong kind of strength, she said. She had her hand flat on his chest over his heartbeat. The gathering warriors thought I made a mistake. I have thought about it every time we've gotten through something hard. Every time you have stood next to me and not needed to be the biggest thing in the room. I am never the biggest thing in the room, he said. Not in this canyon. You are exactly what you need to be, she said, with a finality that was not dismissal but the opposite, the kind of statement that closes a question because the answer is known. He tightened his arm around her and pressed his lips to her temple. I chose you at the gathering too, he said. I just did not know it at the time. You chose to look at me and not look away, she said. That was not hard, he said. She made the sound that was her laugh, low and brief and genuine, and it vibrated against his chest where she was lying, and he felt it everywhere. The hardest moment came in deep autumn of the second year. Word came down from the mountain scouts that a Boulder Brow raiding party, 12 warriors, the same clan whose chief warrior Vok had found Joseph so amusing at the gathering, had moved into the upper pass routes and taken a Grimrock supply wagon. The raid was not random. Vok had, apparently, not forgotten his conversation at the gathering fire, and the Grimrock's new trade prosperity was a provocation to a clan that had its own trade ambitions. The Grimrock Council met. They could send a retaliatory force, which would begin a raid-counter-raid cycle that had historically been disastrous for mountain clans on both sides. They could appeal to the Valley Settlement's arbitration structure, which was slow and tilted toward the settled towns. Or they could meet the Boulder Brow for a formal challenge negotiation, which was the oldest and in many ways the most practical of the Orc Mountain traditions. A challenge negotiation requires a representative to stand for the clan's interests, Prusk said at the council meeting. Traditionally, a warrior champion who can speak for the clan's legal position in the Orc common tradition. Ugak said, I will go. There was a silence that was not disagreement so much as weight. Vok will be there, said one of the senior warriors. He is the one who ordered the raid. He will see a formal negotiation as an opportunity for a personal challenge. He has wanted one since the gathering. I know, Ugak said. Joseph, who was at the council meeting in his capacity as trade liaison, said, What does a personal challenge mean in this context? Single combat for settlement of the grievance, Prusk said. Old form. The winner's clan position on the disputed goods is upheld. No blood feud, clean resolution. Is it to the death? To yield, Prusk said. Though yielding against Vok can be complicated depending on how the challenge goes. Joseph looked at Ugak. She was looking at the council table, not at him. He could read her posture. She was not afraid, she was annoyed, which was different. She had wanted a trade solution and was being offered a combat solution, and the combat solution was the one that had a clear path through the problem, so she was going to take it, and she did not want to discuss the risk involved because discussing it would not change the decision. He said, I will go with you. She looked at him. You need a trade witness at a challenge negotiation, he said, to represent the supply wagon's inventory claim. Otherwise the goods just go where the combat decides, with no accounting for what was taken. Prusk, who had very wise eyes, said, That is correct. Ugak held Joseph's gaze for a moment. He met it steady, the same way he had looked at her across the canyon at the gathering, not flinching. You will stay back, she said. I will stand with the delegation and do my job, he said, same as always. Vok will say things about you being there. Vok says things, Joseph said. I have survived Vok's commentary before. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said to the council, We go in 4 days. The challenge negotiation site was a flat area above the snowline, a traditional meeting ground that had been used by the mountain clans for generations, broad enough for a combat circle, high enough that neither clan's territory was implicated, cold enough that everyone had a physical reason to resolve things quickly. The Boulder Brow arrived in force, 12 warriors in their full clan regalia, bone-sewn vests and painted shields. Vok was in the center, enormous and confident, And when the Grimrock delegation came into sight across the flat ground, his gaze went immediately to Joseph, standing at Ugak's shoulder with the trade ledger, and he laughed. It was a long, loud laugh. His warriors joined it. The cold mountain air carried it clearly. Ugak kept walking. She did not look at Joseph, and she did not look at Vok. She looked at the center of the flat ground with the focus of someone who has already decided what is going to happen. Vok stepped out ahead of his delegation and said, "Grimtusk brings her little pet human to a clan negotiation. Is this so the human can tell us the value of what we took? Perhaps in coins, since Grimrock fights with merchants now." Joseph set down the trade ledger on a flat rock and straightened. He said in functional Orcish that he had been building for a year and a half. The supply wagon taken 3 weeks ago carried 40 units of coastal salt, 12 bolts of trade cloth, and 6 sealed jars of harbormaster spice. The current market value in mountain trade is, he stated the number in Orcish precisely. There was a silence. He had chosen Orcish deliberately, and it landed the way he had hoped. It was one thing for a human to be present at a clan negotiation. It was another thing for that human to quote trade value in Orcish, directly, accurately, without a translator. Vok's warriors exchanged glances that Joseph read correctly as recalibration. Ugak had gone very still beside him, in the way she went still when something surprised her positively. Vok recovered quickly. He was not a stupid man, whatever else he was. The human memorized some numbers, he said in common, switching back. Impressive training. He looked at Ugak. You came for a challenge, Grimtusk, or did you bring the human to negotiate for you too? I came for the return of the supply wagon goods, Ugak said. If you want to settle it in the circle, I will settle it in the circle. With pleasure, Vok said, and the smiling quality left his face. What followed was the most difficult 40 minutes of Joseph's life, and he was not even the one in the circle. Ugak fought with the controlled, precise economy she brought to everything. Vok was enormous, and he was genuinely skilled. This was not posturing. He had the reflexes of a warrior who had spent his life in the mountains and the power of a man who had never once met his physical equal. He was faster than someone his size should have been. He landed hits that would have crumpled a lesser fighter. Ugak was not a lesser fighter. She took hits that would have broken Joseph's ribs and kept moving, using the size differential as a tool rather than a problem. She was inside his reach range faster than he could comfortably adjust, making him turn, making him compensate, wearing him down by forcing constant redirection. She hit him 3 times cleanly in the space of 10 minutes and took 2 hard hits in return, and neither of them yielded. And the mountain wind was cutting across the flat ground, and every warrior on both sides was watching without making a sound. Joseph stood at the edge of the circle and watched her and did not make a sound either, but his hands, behind his back, were locked together hard enough that the knuckles had gone white. The turn came in the second quarter of the fight. Vok overcommitted to a forward drive that was too confident, and Ugak went sideways under it and hit the back of his knee with a strike that dropped him to one knee. And then she was at his shoulder and had his sword arm controlled and her short blade at his throat, and the whole mountain seemed to stop breathing. "Yield," she said. 4 seconds. "Yield," Vok said in a voice that had lost all its theater, just the word flat and truthful. Ugak stepped back and sheathed her blade. She was breathing hard, a thin line of blood from her lip where she had taken a hit that had split it, her braids loosened from the fight. She looked, Joseph thought, extraordinary. She looked over at him. He held her gaze and let everything he felt be visible in his face, the relief, the pride, the bone-deep gladness. She gave him the small, controlled movement of her mouth that was her smile. The supply wagon goods were returned. The challenge negotiation was concluded. The Boulder-Brow delegation left the flat ground with the particular quiet dignity of people who have had a lesson reinforced. When they were an hour down the mountain and the camp was being set for night, Ugak sat beside Joseph at the fire, closer than she usually sat in the presence of the band, and he reached over without announcement and found her hand and held it, and she let him, and did not move away. and when he looked at the side of her face, she was looking at the fire with the expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. Prusk made tea from his herbs and passed it around, and said nothing, which was the most eloquent form of approval available to an ancient healer who had already seen everything. The winter that followed was quiet and good. The Grimrock's trade network, now firmly rooted through the recovered salt lines and the partnership with Fen Toll's administration, was producing the most stable income the clan had seen in a decade. Veth was a functioning ally rather than an obstacle. The Boulder Brow, having had their challenge answered cleanly, did not raid again. Joseph's trade liaison work had become indispensable in ways that had started practically and deepened into something more. He was not a clan member. That was a specific designation with its own rituals and meanings, not something that happened casually, but he was present in every meaningful sense, and the Grimrock had a way of acknowledging presence that was more concrete than formal status. You were given tasks. You were included in decisions. Your input was sought. By these measures, he had become part of the fabric of the canyon in a way that required no ceremony to be real. He sailed the Marin twice that winter, short coastal runs for the salt trade. The harbor in Crestfall Bay was familiar and his, but each time he returned to the canyon road at the base of the mountain and looked up at the stone walls against the peaks, the feeling he had was not coming back to a place he was visiting. It was the feeling of coming home. On an evening in late winter, when the passes were closed with snow, and the canyon was deep and quiet, and the hearth in the stone building was the center of the world, Ugak came in from the evening rounds and unwound her braid, and let the red bead click onto the table and sat down across from him, where he was repairing a set of trade ledger pages that had gotten damp in transit, and said, "There is a Grimrock custom." He set down his pen. "Tell me. For someone who lives in the canyon and works with the clan and is," she paused, choosing her words with the same care she applied to everything bound to a clan member, "there is a custom, a declaration in front of the assembled clan. Both people speak. They say what they intend and what they offer. There is no ceremony to it, no officiant, just the speaking." He looked at her. "What do they say?" "What is true," she said. "That is the only requirement." What is true between them said aloud in front of witnesses. And after it is said and known and the canyon knows it, she met his gaze. It is not a human wedding. It does not require a document, it just requires that you mean it. He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "The clan assembly is in 7 days, at the end of the season's trading summary traditionally." She paused. "If you want to." "Ugak," he said. "Yes. Do I strike you as a person who would hesitate about this?" The corner of her mouth moved. "No," she said. "I simply wanted to give you the chance to." "I do not need the chance," he said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she looked up at him from where she was sitting, which was one of the rare positions in which he was taller, and he cupped her face in his hands, his smaller, rougher, weather-worn hands against the green of her cheeks, and said, "I have been waiting for you to ask me something like this since that storm at the gathering when you put your hand on my shoulder, and it took me 2 weeks to stop thinking about it." Her expression did what it rarely did in public. It opened, fully, every layer of the warmth she usually contained, visible and unguarded. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. 7 days, she said. 7 days, he agreed. The assembly was held in the main canyon gathering space, not as large as the summer gathering with all the clans, but full enough. The whole Grimrock settlement was present, plus Fen Toll's personal envoy from Veth, who had ridden up when the news had reached the monastery, and Draco, who had cried exactly twice preparing for this and was refusing to acknowledge either instance. When Joseph and Ugak walked to the center of the assembly space together, there was the particular quality of attention that a large group of people gives when they know they are watching something that will be talked about. He spoke first. He had thought about what he would say for 7 days, and in the end he said the same thing he had been building toward since the day he walked through the gate of the gathering and did not run when the laughter started. He said, "I came to the Grimrock Canyon looking for work and a way forward. I found both, and I found something I had not been looking for, which is where to put everything I have. I put it here. I put it with you. I mean this fully, and I will mean it for as long as I am standing." She held his gaze for a moment after he finished. Then she said in a voice that carried the whole assembly clearly, the same way she had spoken at the gathering all those months ago when she said come and told him to follow her. "I chose at the gathering. I do not choose slowly or without reason. I chose what I saw, a man who looked when he should have looked away, who stayed when he should have gone, who stood next to me when standing next to me cost him something. He is what I want. He is what I keep." She paused. "I do not want anything else." The assembly was quiet for a moment. Then Prusk, from somewhere near the back, made a sound like approval, which was the highest form of endorsement available from a man who approved of nothing easily. Draco made the sound that was either a cheer or a sob or possibly both, and several of the younger warriors followed. And from the far edge of the assembly, two of the senior warriors who had been at the gathering, who had been among the crowd that laughed when Joseph had walked through the gate, looked at each other and nodded with the solemn, straightforward respect of people who have been watching something prove itself over time and have updated their thinking accordingly. Joseph looked up at Ugak, and she looked down at him, and then she kissed him in front of all of them, direct and certain, the way she did everything, the way she had kissed him in the cell corridor and on the road back from the mountain negotiation, and 100 times in the stone building with the hearth. In front of the whole assembled canyon, in front of Fen Toll's envoy, in front of Draco, who was now definitely crying, in front of every person who had ever laughed at the small human who had walked into the Grimrock Gathering looking for work. She kissed him, and she did not make it brief or spare or apologetic, and when they broke apart she held his gaze with that dark, steady warmth and did not look at anyone else. He had his hands on her arms, feeling the leather vest and the copper bracer and the warmth underneath, same as the first time. He thought of the gathering all those months ago, the laughter when he walked through the gate, her face across the crowd, that first, assessing, undaunted look. The walk to the stone table, her expecting without checking that he would follow. He thought of everything that had come after, and none of it felt like luck. It felt like what happens when two people who are paying attention find each other and are honest about what they see. Around them, the assembly had started the noise that is the specific noise of a community that has just witnessed something good. Prusk was pouring something from one of his herb bottles into a series of wooden cups with the efficiency of a man who had prepared for this outcome, which he absolutely had. Draco appeared at Joseph's elbow with a cup and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this resolution for the better part of a year, and was extremely pleased with how it had turned out. "I told Prusk you would say yes immediately," Draco said. "You were right," Joseph said. "I told him that at the gathering, when she walked to the stone table, I said that one is going to stay." Ugak, who had heard this, looked at Draco with an expression that was exasperated and warm in equal parts. "You were 18, she said. "I had good eyes at 18, Draco said, with complete confidence, and took a cup from Prusk's tray and walked off. Ugak looked at Joseph, and the public warmth that she was still learning to wear without flinching was fully there, visible and hers and not contained. He took her hand. She held it in the way she had learned to, adjusting the grip to match, her rough, warm palm against his, the copper bracer cool against his wrist. Outside the canyon walls, the winter passes were still closed. The Marin was in the harbor at Crestfall Bay, solid and waiting. The salt route was open and profitable and stable. Fen Toll was in the administrator's seat in Veth, and the trade lanes were clean. Vox Boulderbrow had learned their lesson in the circle and gone back to their own range. Prusk's herb garden had survived the winter under Draco's enthusiastic and largely unnecessary management. Everything that had needed to be set right had been set right. He stood in the middle of the canyon that was his home, holding the hand of the woman who had walked across a crowded gathering to look at him closely, and decided, with the directness and certainty that was entirely her own, that he was exactly what she wanted, and he felt the warmth in his chest that he had first noticed the evening of the gathering settle into something permanent, something that was not going anywhere, something that was the right word finally arrived for it, simple and accurate home. She looked at the side of his face, and he looked at her, and neither of them looked away.